Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we're going to talk about the asham talui, the suspended guilt offering, which shows up in Horayot Chet Amud Bet 8b in context of when you don't give it. So let's talk about the asham talui for a minute. It's a very strange korban. Other ashamot, other korbanot asham, guilt offerings, we know exactly what you bring them for. You do a certain sin, you know that you did it, you give that korban. We also know that for the korban hatat, the sin offering, we know you do a certain sin, you know you did it, you give a korban. Asham talui is a strange bird. It's strange because you give it when you're not sure if you did a sin. It's actually specifically for when you're in safek. And then if you find out that you actually did the sin, then you give a korban hatat. So the context in Horayot 8b is actually a context where you have a safek, you have a doubt as to whether you did a certain sin, but that is a sin that doesn't warrant a hatat. If you did the wrong thing, it warrants a different korban called a korban olevi raid. And if you want to know more about that, go back to our early Gemara, our early shiurim on Masachet Shavuot about Korban Olev raid. And basically, the way that we paskin is that asham talui is only given if you have a safek, if you have a doubt about having committed a sin, that if you did it for sure, you would have to give specifically a korban chatat. If you did it like without knowledge, or if you did it on purpose, it would be something that would incur karet excision. Okay. So that's why there are certain averot where if you have a safek about them, you still wouldn't give an asham talui. For example, tumat mikdash v'kodashav. You have a safek as to whether you entered the Beit HaMikdash when you were tamei. If you knew that you did that, you would give a korban olev yored, which is not a korban chata. You can go back to Vayikra Perek Hey to learn more about the korban olev yored. But the point is, you wouldn't do it. Or, for example, if you weren't sure if maybe you ate a bug, right, which is not something that is korban chatat worthy. It is something that is a lav, a lo ta'aseh, that one would get malkot for, one would get lashes for, and there is no korban for it. In that case, you also wouldn't give an asham talui. So I want to understand a little bit more about this asham talui concept. What does it mean to give a korban as a just in case korban? And if you find out that you actually committed the sin, to then have to give another korban, the korban hatat. So what is the point of the asham talui? And what we're going to see here is that actually there are various different views as to what the asham talui is actually doing? Is it something that you are volunteering to give? Is it something that's an obligation? Is it something that's affecting some sort of atonement? Is it something that doesn't affect atonement, but is actually just a placeholder in some way? Is it something that's actually in some way punishing you for being in safek? How much is this about uncertainty in general and that you entered a situation of doubt? And how much is this a placeholder for the hatat? Right? The more it's a placeholder for the chatat, the less it should apply to any other sins that don't warrant a chatat. The more it's about uncertainty in general, the more you're going to find shitot, which we don't follow la halakha, but the more you're going to find shitot that are going to be trying to expand when you use asham talui beyond just a situation of a sin that warrants a chatat. So let's jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So we have here the pasuk that gives us asham talui. Basically, the pasuk says, "V'nefesh ki techeta ve'asta achat mikol mitzvot Hashem asher lo te'asena." If a person sins and does any of the mitzvot that they're not supposed to do, in other words, you violated a lo ta'aseh, v'lo yada, and they didn't know, ve'ashem, and they are guilty, v'nasa avono, they are going to carry their punishment or literally they're going to get punished. Now, this velo yada, and they don't know, is not just going to be understood as they didn't know and they did the wrong thing, but that they don't know whether they sinned. Next pasuk too, Vehivi ayil tamim min hatzon be'erkecha la'asham el kohen. That person is going to bring a ram that's unblemished as an asham to the kohen. V'chiper alav kohen al shegato asher shagag, and the kohen is going to gain atonement. Notice gain atonement. V'hu lo yada v'nislach lo. Right, and that person didn't know, and they will be forgiven. Now, again, the pshat of the pasuk looks like the person did not know originally when they did the sin. They made a mistake and they did the sin. But it's understood by Chazal to say v'hula yada means you don't even know if you did the sin. Ashamhu, ashom, asham la Hashem. It's a guilt offering. Guilt has been incurred before God. Now, this is very interesting because it does present the asham talui. If this is how we're understanding these psukim, it presents something v'chiper alav kohen, right? It gets you some sort of kapara. V'nislachlo, you are forgiven. But forgiven for what? Because if you find out that you did the avera, you're going to have to give a korban hatat anyway, right? So one train of thought is to basically say, actually, what you need to be forgiven for is getting yourself into a situation of safek in the first place, right? But that's not going to be the only take. The Gemara in Horayot, as I mentioned, the Mishnah actually on Chedemot Bet discusses that ein mivi'in asham talui, you don't bring an asham talui, a suspended asham al aseh v'alo taseh mikdash, on things having to do with violations of tuma related to the mikdash or related to kachim, and we explained why, because it's not a korban hatat. It's not a korban hatat incurring sin, it's a korban olev yored incurring sin. But to be honest, as much as that's simple for the Mishnah in Horayot, that's actually a machloket within a Mishnah in Kritud. And I want you to see that machloket because that machloket does reflect how much is this korban asham talui about uncertainty or doubt in general, and how much is it about specifically having done something that might incur a korban hatat. And it seems to be a machloket. So the Mishnah in Kritud, Perek Vav, Mishnah Gimel, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Mitnadev Adam Asham Talui B'chol Yom V'chol Sha'ah She'yirtzeh. Rabbi Eliezer says, you can volunteer an Asham Talui anytime, any day. Okay? V'hi nikret Asham Chasidim. That's going to be called the guilt offering of the pious. Right? I want you to imagine what it looks like to craft a life where you say you can give an offering, a just in case I sinned offering every day. Right? This is sort of the Jewish guilt kind of trope. It's interesting to come from Rabbi Eliezer because Rabbi Eliezer, as in Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, in general represents a more, I would say, a more ascetic view in general than some of the other some of the other Tanaim. Some people think, Professor Vered Noam wrote an article on this, some people think Rabbi Eliezer actually has ideas that are more similar to the Essenes, meaning the Dead Sea sect, than to the Pharisees. And he's kind of an uncomfortable transitional figure. But here he's telling you, your word that you did a sin any day, asham talui. By the way, it doesn't seem like it has to be a sin that incurs a korban chatat. It's just any sin you might have done. I don't want to be in uncertainty. I don't want to be in uncertainty, so I'm going to give a korban. Amru alav Bava ben Buti, they said about Bava ben Buta is what we call him. They said about Bava ben Buta, who lived at the time of the Mikdash, Shaya mitnadev asham talui b'chol yom. He used to give an asham talui every day. Chutz me'achar Yom Kippurim yom echad, except for one day after Yom Kippur. Amar, and he said, Hamaon hazeh, by this temple, meaning he's giving a swear, he's swearing, like, I swear on the temple, Ilu hayu manichin li, if they would let me, hayiti mevi, I would bring even today, even the day after Yom Kippur, right? Wow. Ela omrim li, but what did they say? Hamtein ad shetikanes l'safek. Wait at least until you know that you have a doubt that you might have done a sin, right? You literally, Yom Kippur just ended. You don't even know if you sinned. Yom Kippur was mechaper, everything yesterday. You don't even know if you don't even have a doubt about anything. So don't just give it just in case. Give it just in case once you have a doubt. Now, I want to notice they don't say give it once you have a doubt about having done an avera that could incur a hatat. Sounds like any avera, right? So that's yet another track, right? Rabbi Eliezer says it's a nedava, it's a voluntary korban anytime you want. On any doubt, it sounds like even if you don't have a doubt, right? And the response to Baba Ben Buta seems like as long as you have a doubt, that is reason enough to give an asham talui. But the chachamim say, no, ein mevi'in asham talui, ela davar shezdono charet mishigato hatat. You only bring an asham talui on a doubt about an avera that would incur excision if you did it on purpose and would incur a korban hatat if you did it without knowing either that it was wrong or that the circumstances were such that you were actually doing that problematic thing, right? That is a much more contained version of asham talui. Asham talui is a placeholder for a hatat. It's not any uncertainty. Maybe there's uncertainty. It's a placeholder for a hatat. So we have sort of Rabbi Eliezer all the way at one side saying, give it as an adava anytime, even if you're not in doubt, it seems like. You have on the other side the Chachamim saying it's only for a korban hatat incurring avera if you're in doubt about it. And then it seems like the response to Baba Ben Buta is somewhere in the middle, which is you have to have doubt about, like a concrete doubt about having done some avera, but it can be any avera. It doesn't have to just be korban chatat incurring avera. So the Gemara in Kritot actually spends some time trying to flesh out what does this mean about the asham talui. So my time to Rabbi Eliezer is the question on Kafeh Amud Aleph. Rabbi Eliezer, the reason why he says you can bring it any time, because he says if this was something that was an obligation, then why would you have to give a korban chatat when you find out that you did the actual sin? Why shouldn't the asham talui cover you if it is an obligation? I think it's a korban adava. It's a voluntary offering. And if it's a voluntary offering, you can offer it any time, right? Even if you're not in suffix. But the rabbis who say, no, it's only on a korban chatat incurring avera. V'Rabbanan olu shlamim hu da'atu b'neder v'nedava. They say, no. Hatat and asham, they're not nedavas. They're not nedavas. Those are not voluntary offerings. Those are offerings for a sin. They're chovas. They're required. Ola and shlamim, the fully burnt offering, or the shlamim where you eat part of it and quote unquote the mizbeach eats part of it, right? Those things are allowed to be given as you can take, an oath, you can volunteer them, right? But chatat and asham, what are you talking about? An asham talui is a kind of asham, and it's thus a chova. V'asham tailu. So let me explain to you, why do you have to give the korban chatat once you find out that you did it for sure, the sin? V'asham talui hainu tama demaiti makme demiti adonai. I'm going to tell you, actually, it's a little bit different. We're going to tell you, why do you have to bring the asham at all if you're going to bring the hatat when you find out that you did it? Lahagein alav, in order to protect you. The Torah chasa al gufan shel Yisrael. The Torah protects Jewish bodies. In other words, it seems like, why do you need this placeholder for a korban hatat? The suggestion is that so long as you don't find out that you did this avera for sure, you actually need something to protect you in case you did and warrant a punishment. So let's say, for example, you never find out that you did it for sure, but you actually did it, but you never find it out. You're just specific all that time. Give the asham talui because it gets you some protection from punishment. Let's say you find out 2 days later that you did the hatat. For those 2 days, you have the protection, right? Now, this suggests that there's sort of an immediate reward and punishment cycle that happens, which is interesting in and of itself. But those are our two logics. Is it an adava? It's a voluntary offering, or is it something that is supposed to protect you as a placeholder until you give the chatat? But then, interestingly, Rav Acha B'ri Rava brings up a suggestion of, well, actually, maybe there could be two tracks in asham talui. Amarle Rav Acha B'ri Rava, Rav Ashi, Rav Acha B'ri Rava says to Rav Ashi, Dilma asham talui ka'ola ushlamim. Actually, maybe an asham talui is less like a usual korban asham, less like a usual korban chatat, and instead is actually much more like a korban ola and a korban shlamim. In what way? Ma ola ushlamim da'atu b'chova va'atu b'nedava, an ola and a shlamim, sometimes you give them as a required korban, right? Think about it. We have certain shlamim that you're supposed to give on holidays. Certain olas, I mean, think about the korban tamid. That is a daily ola offering, right? There are certain things that they're required, but you can also give them as an adava, as voluntary. So asham talui, maybe when it comes to an asham talui, nami da'ati b'cholav ati nami b'nedava. Maybe sometimes it's required, as in when you know you are in safek, and in that situation, it is a stand-in, maybe for a korban hatat until you know. And sometimes it's an adava anytime you're worried that you might have done something wrong, even if you don't have a concrete safek, or if you did an avera, or you have a suffix, whether you did an avera, that doesn't actually get a korban, right? So really interesting, really, really interesting. And we're going to skip the rest, right? So we have a few sort of tracks, ways of thinking about it. Is this something that is basically about uncertainty in general, about worry? Is this something that is about a stand-in for a korban hatat? Now, another place where we see this conversation sort of taking shape is actually in the question of what exactly was the situation when you came into this doubt? Are we talking about there was like a piece of food on the table that might be permissible fat to eat, but might be prohibited fat, meaning chalev, as we call it? Is that what we're talking about? It's one piece and you're not sure which one it was? Was it kosher? Was it not? And remember, we're not talking about any kashrut. We have to be talking about something that's specifically korban chatat worthy or karit worthy. And that's why we're talking about chalev, that kind of fat of an animal. Or are we talking about there are two pieces and one is for sure chalev, one is for sure forbidden fat, and the other one is for sure permitted. It's for sure what we call shuman, right? Does it have to be that you know that there's something usser there and you're just not sure if you ate it? You know that you ate one of these, but you're not sure which one? Or is it just, well, I ate something and I wasn't sure if it itself, and it was the only piece, I wasn't sure if it itself was chalev or not. So let's take a look. That's also going to relate to this question of, are we just talking about uncertainty, or are we talking about something that is a definite placeholder for a korban chatat? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, on Yitzayin Amud Bet and Kritut, Hayu lefanav shtei chatichot, a person has two pieces of meat in front of them, achat shel shuman, one is permissible fat, v'achat shel chalev, the other one is prohibited fat. Achal achat man, ve'enu yodei eze man achal, they definitely ate one of them, but they don't know which one they ate. Chayav, they have to give an asham talui for that suffix. But chaticha achat, but if it was one piece of meat, suffix shel chalev, suffix shel shuman, we don't know, and we didn't know if it was prohibited meat, prohibited fat, or if it was permitted fat, v'achala, and you ate it, and the guy ate it, patur, they are exempt from giving an asham talui. Okay, now I want you to think about the logic there, because the Gemara then continues, and Iteve Rab Abaye says that can't be true. What about Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Eliezer Omer koi chayavin alav asham talui. Rabbi Eliezer says if you eat a koi, a certain animal that it's not determined whether it's a behema, a domesticated animal, which would mean that its chalev is prohibited to eat, or it's a wild animal, which would mean that its chalev is permissible to eat, meaning it's one piece. We're just not sure if you're allowed to eat it or you're not allowed to eat it, meaning it's a piece of chalev from a koi. You're not sure if you're allowed to eat it or not allowed to eat it because you're not sure if a koi is halachically considered a domesticated animal, a behema, or a wild animal, a chaya. And yet, Rabbi Eliezer says you have to give an asham talui, right? So that seems not to work. But then again, we know that Rabbi Eliezer is a maximalist when it comes to asham talui. But we'll get back to it. Let's see how the Gemara explains. Then we have again, Amar of Nachman, Amar Rabba Bar Avua, Amar Rav. Again, Hayu lefanav shtei chatichot, chat shel chalev, chat shel shuman, v'achal achat mehan, ve'enu yodei eze mehan achal, chayav. If you have two pieces of meat, two pieces of fat, one is permitted, the other is for sure prohibited, and you ate one of them, but you don't know which one you ate, you have to give an asham talui. But if it's chaticha, one piece, suffix shel chalev, suffix shel shuman, and you ate it, but you weren't sure But that's the only piece there. You weren't sure if it was chelev, which is prohibited if it is a domesticated animal, or it was shuman, which is permitted if it's a domesticated animal. Va'achalan, you ate it, patur, you don't have to give an asham talui. Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, my time at the Rav, what is the reasoning behind this? Kasavar, he thinks, this is because they were quoting Rav, shtei chatichot ikba isura. When you have two pieces of meat there and one is for sure chelev, you have an established prohibition there. But chaticha achat, if it's one piece of meat and you don't know its identity, lo kava isura, you haven't established any prohibition. Meaning, in order for somebody to have to do an asham talui, it's not just I'm uncertain if I did the right thing or not. It's I know there was something usser there, right? This is not just any doubt you might have. It's I know there was something usser there. And then the Gemara says, not surprisingly, Rabbi Eliezer, who's so expansive about asham talui, lo baik v'yuta surah. He doesn't need you to actually have a prohibition established there. Just the fact that you're in doubt about anything is good enough, right? And then the Gemara continues and gives you again another version of the same conversation, but then says, wait, Rabbi Eliezer is even more expansive than what we've already said. Amar Rabba bar Avua Amar Rav. Rabba Avua says in the name of Rav, Chaticha Safik Shel Chelev Safik Shel Shuman Va'achala. If it's a single piece of fat from an animal, and we're not sure if it's chelev prohibited or shuman permitted, and a person ate it, banu l'machloket Rabbi Eliezer v'chachamim. Here we are. We're in the machloket of Rabbi Eliezer v'chachamim. Makes perfect sense, right? Rabbi Eliezer is more expansive, and chachamim are more. They're narrower. It's not just about any uncertainty. That's not what we're talking. It's about a placeholder for a korban hatat. And then the Gemara says, what do you mean this is a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim? The Rabbi Eliezer, my irya ki achala. For Rabbi Eliezer, you don't even need to have eaten the piece of meat. Afilu lo achala nami, even if you hadn't eaten the piece of meat. That's not, because Rabbi Eliezer says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer, asham talui, you can just give an asham talui whenever you want. Meaning, you don't even have to have a doubt, right? So Amar Rav Ashi, so Rav Ashi says, okay, Rabbi Eliezer, Aliba de Bava ben Buta. We're talking about Rabbi Eliezer kind of inhabiting the constraints of the Bava ben Buta story, Ditnan, where they said in the Mishnah, Ela Omrim lo, they would say to him, Amtin achi tikanes lebeit safek. Wait until you're in some sort of safek, right? So meaning Rabbi Eliezer could go with Bava ben Buta, like with the Bava ben Buta story, they could all be bevat achat. Or I would say you could try to take that story and say that the people who responded to Bava ben Buta are trying to go more in the direction of Chachamim, right? So on the spectrum of, is this just about doubt or is this a placeholder for the Korban Chatat, right? Rabbi Eliezer is clearly at one side, Chachamim are clearly at the other. The question is the Bava ben Buta story and the people who respond to him, where are they, right? Are they more towards Rabbi Eliezer? Maybe Bava ben Buta is more towards Rabbi Eliezer, even though that's a little anachronistic, right? Maybe Bava ben Buta is a little towards Rabbi Eliezer, and the people who respond to him and say, make sure at least you have a suffix, they're a little bit more towards Chachamim, or maybe all of them are really just about suffix in general, whereas Chachamim are really about korban hatat. Now, in terms of what the asham talui is actually doing, I think it's very interesting that we have in Kritu Kafhei Amud Bet, there's a citation of a Braita that goes like this. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Chamisha ashamot mechaprim, the 5 ashamot, right? You give ashamot for 5 different averot, but asham talui ein mechaper. Asham talui doesn't give kapara. Now, that's what most manuscripts say. Some manuscripts say ein mechaper kapara gemura. It doesn't give full atonement, but it gives partial atonement. So this already opens us up to the question of, okay, well, what's the asham talui really doing, right? The asham talui, we saw one version is the asham talui is keeping you from getting punished in case you need to give a hatat. And maybe another version here is the asham talui gives you a little bit of kapara, maybe for getting yourself into the suffix in the first place, but it doesn't give you kapara for the actual full sin itself. Maybe, right? This is trying to figure out what this asham talui is actually doing. Okay. Now, I want to end by basically saying that a little bit, regardless of whether you're more on the Rabbi Eliezer side or you're more on the Chachamim side, right? That this is more about suffix in general or a just in case in general, you always want a safety net, or it's more a stand-in for the korban hatat. Either way, it's pretty bolate. It stands out the idea that you would have to give a korban for a suffix. And so I just want to end with a few of the more machshava kind of philosophical perspectives on this that you could pin maybe more easily on Rabbi Eliezer or more easily on the people who respond to Bava Ben Buta, who seem to indicate that it's any kind of suffix, right? Rabbi Eliezer might not even need suffix. He might just want a safety net all the time, right? You could probably more easily pin this on those who are more expansive, but I think you could even read it into Chachamim as well. And it goes like this. The Ramban in Vayikra Perek Hey, where we learn about the asham talui, v'tam asham talui, the reason for the asham talui, mipnei sheba'alav savur she'ein alav onesh. They think that they're not going to get punished. Ki lo noda shechata. They didn't know that they even sinned. Mipnei zeh hachmir alav hakatuv b'sveiko yoter mivada'o. Therefore, the Torah is even more machmir about a suffix, a doubt, than when you know you did it on purpose, because you don't even realize that you sinned. Now, does that mean that the asham talui is trying to get you to try to figure out if you sinned? Like maybe it's kind of a motivator to go try to figure out if you sinned, don't just ignore it. And also when he says, that the Torah is more machmir, is stricter about the asham talui. What do we mean by that? So Rabbeinu Yonah, his student, explains what we mean by that. And basically, Rabbeinu Yonah says an asham talui is more expensive. Actually, it's an asham talui. I'm looking for, if you bring a hatat, it's enough to bring a hatat that's worth a danka, which is a mea, like a coin. It's like 60 cents an hour. But for an asham talui, it has to be 2 slime, which is 48 ma'in, which, do 48 times 60 cents. It's about $30, right? But the point is, it's much more expensive. An asham talui is more expensive than a hatat, which means you're paying more for your suffix than you would for knowing that you did the sin. And he says, "V'atam bazeh," the reason lama achmiru al suffix yoter min avadai, why they were more, why they were stricter about a doubtful situation than when you're certain that you did something wrong. Omer Mori Harav, my teacher, the Ramban says, Shalom Ibnei Sha'al Havadai, because when it comes to a certain sin, meaning a sin that you're certain you did, Mesim Adam Hachet Elibo, a person keeps it in mind. V'doeg u'mitcharet alav v'chozer b'tshuva shlema. They're going to do tshuva. They're going to regret it. Aval ala safek. But if it's doubtful, they're not sure. They give excuses, right? Or they figure out their own reasoning. They say, no, maybe that was a fine piece of meat and it was totally permissible. And the person won't give thought to doing tshuva. And that's why they made it more expensive. And in fact, the Shulchan Aruch says, Safek Avera tzarich yoter tshuva me'avera. A doubt about maybe having done an avera requires more tshuva, right? Me'avera vadai, from a certain avera, meaning an avera you're certain you did. Ki yoter mitcharet k'sheyodea she'asa. A person has more regret when they know that they did it, than if they don't know. And that's why an asham talui costs more than a hatat, right? Because you have to actually think about what is the possibility that I sin. So in some way, the asham talui is trying to get a person, you could either say it's trying to get you out of a rote way of doing things, or it's just trying to get you to pay attention and try to find out if you did do the avera, or if you didn't. And right? We want you to actually not think of it as what I would call a nothing burger. Most literally, we want you to think about it as this is a possibility of Avera, and maybe it's how did I even get into this situation in the first place? Or maybe it's, wow, I have to be more careful about my meat, and make sure that I'm not eating chalev. I want to do one last thing, which is I do think it's interesting, and in Moshe Halbertal's book, the the Birth of Doubt, he talks about the fact that there are some people who are more comfortable with suffix and some who are less comfortable with suffix, right? Being in an uncertain position. And it is interesting, the Babli and Chulin, and you can learn it on your own because we're running out of time, but the Babli and Chulin essentially explains a pasuk in Yechezkel as saying that Yechezkel never ate from a behema, never ate from an animal, shehora b'chacham, that there was a shaila about, and a sage had to permit it, meaning he didn't even want to eat food that was permitted because there was a question, there was an uncertainty about it, and that uncertainty had to be resolved by a chacham. He didn't even want to eat such a piece of meat, right? And then the Gemara in Chulin actually a few dapim later talks about a situation of one of the rabbis who they basically say, how could he have eaten this thing? After all, Yechezkel never ate anything that uh, 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 a sage had to paskin on. And the Gemara ends with Hani Mili Milta Detalia Bisvara, right? If we're talking about a halachic authority was needed to give their own reasoning to explain, then he wouldn't have eaten it, even though it had been permitted by that sage. But Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, who was the person in question, Agamare Samach, he had a received tradition, and that's what he was following. So the question of how much it's different religious personalities, right? How much room do you have for uncertainty of having done wrong or not having done wrong? And you want everything to be simple and clear, and it comes out even here. Thanks, everyone. Great learning with you.